This presentation is going to look at the various elements of poetry, tools that poets use when they are trying to add to the poem's sound, meaning, and emotional effect on the reader. All of these elements of poetry are going to be explained in a little bit more detail throughout the various lessons within this unit, but this presentation will give you a good overview of the types of terms and concepts that we're going to be really focusing on within this poetry unit in the course. Couple overview concepts here. Poetry is the art of expressing one's thoughts in verse. It uses few words to convey its message, much fewer than what a prose passage would do. It is meant to be read aloud, and this is something important to keep in mind, as if you're having a difficult time really understanding the meaning of a poem, it might actually help you to hear the poem in your voice rather than simply reading it silently to yourself. Poetry is intended to arouse emotions. It uses imagery or figures of speech to explain feelings or to create a mental picture or idea. These concepts and pictures suggest action or mood, and many poems have a specific rhyme scheme, but poems do not have to rhyme, especially in order to be considered, great pieces of poetry. They don't necessarily have to rhyme. First concept that we'll really look at here are the lines. And a single line in itself can be a poem. Typically, you're going to have poems that are made up of multiple lines, but it is possible to have a single line and that end up being a poem. Single lines, though, tend to be grouped together into stanzas. The more common types of stanzas would be a couplet, which is 2 lines, a triplet, although you also hear the term tercet for 3 lines, quatrain, one of the more common stanzas, is 4 lines, and then you have a quinrain or a cinquain is the more common one of 5 lines, and then a sestet is 7 lines, and an octet is 8 lines. This poem that you have here, To a Snowflake, is 8 lines, and there are 2 stanzas of 4 lines each, so this poem would have 2 quatrains if you were analyzing the structure or the setup organization of the poem. Stanzas are groups of lines, as we mentioned before, often have 4, 5, or 6 lines are the most common ones, although you do have some 2-line stanzas and couplets, especially when it comes to sonnets. Rhyming couplets are typically used within there. Usually a stanza develops a singular idea, and so why a writer might or poet might use stanzas is if there are separate concepts or ideas that they want to give within that poem. It also provides structure and can emphasize those ideas. Beginning a new stanza often signals the beginning of a new image, thought, or idea. If you remember in TPCast, the S stands for shift. Stanzas where they begin and end are good places to look for shifts within the poem. This poem here, First and Last, is 4 stanzas. Each one is only 2 lines, so that would tell you that they are couplets. And as you can see, each stanza signals a new image: tadpole, polecat, bullfrog, kingbird. So the separation of each stanza is because of the new image or concept that is presented within that given couplet. Rhyme and rhyme schemes are rather common in a lot of poems that we're going to be looking at. Words rhyme when they have the same sound. Poems often use rhyme at the end of the lines, and a rhyme scheme is a pattern of rhymes within a poem. Poets use rhyme to add musical sound to their poems. So this poem here, you can see, has a rhyme scheme of this A, B, B, A, because bus, fuss, rhyme, flush, brush, rhyme. Since it's a new rhyme, it is a B, and then again you have bus and fuss all over again, so you have A. Pattern of beats, or a series of stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem, creates rhythm, or meter is also a term that is used for this. Poets create rhythm by using words in which parts are emphasized or not emphasized, and hence you have stressed and unstressed syllables. So the yellow highlighted parts of this poem show what is stressed. So whenever the moon and stars are set, whenever the wind is high, all night long in the dark and wet, a man goes riding by. Late in the night when the fires are out, why does he gallop and gallop about? So again, the yellow highlighted parts would be stressed. If you were marking the stressed and unstressed syllables within a poem, this little cup looks like a lowercase u would be presented over the unstressed, and the slash little tick mark is put over the stressed syllables. Most poems are going to have a consistent rhythm where there is a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. In some cases, you could have a rhythm which is a little bit different, such as this one where it's not consistent the whole way through, but for the most part, there tends to be a rather consistent meter rhythm throughout the whole entire poem. Ends of words tend to be good places. Also, you can look for little words like the, is, and, are. Those tend to be unstressed syllables in many poems, so usually around those words you're going to have some stressed syllables in the preceding or proceeding words. Free verse is poetry written without a regular rhyme, rhythm, and form. It sounds natural, just like everyday conversation. Poets use free verse because it allows them to experiment with the shapes and sounds in their poetry. So there is no rhyme or regular rhythm. So if you're reading this poem, Blossoms, you would simply just read it as the words appear. I never dreamt that tender blossoms would be brown, or precious angels could come down to live in the garden of my giving heart, but here you are, brown angel. And so when this poem is read, it's not meant to have a specific meter throughout, it's just more conversational than anything else. Alliteration is a term that you're familiar with. It's the repetition of the same consonant sounds at the beginning of several words or sentences in a line of poetry. Poets use alliteration to make their poetry musical and more interesting. So waves want to be wheels, they jump for it, and fail, fall, flat. Like pole vaulters and sprawl arms outstretched, foam fingers reaching. So this alliteration of the W and the F sounds add a little bit more musical meter and rhythm to the poems, and it tends to emphasize a lot of images within poetry when you see a lot of alliteration used within lines of poetry. All it takes for a poet to use alliteration is to have two words within the same line of poetry beginning with the same letter. It does not have to be a minimum of 3 or 4. 2 is all that is needed. Imagery is rather common within poetry. It's language that appeals to the 5 sentences. The term word pictures might be associated with imagery or puts pictures in the heads of the reader. It helps the reader to experience and familiarize things in a fresh way using the sentences. So there is a thing beneath the stair with slimy face and oily hair. So the slimy face, oily hair really creates some strong sensory images within the reader, and so they have a concept to what this thing is. So you use the senses of sound, smell, taste, touch, and sight when imagery is trying to be utilized by the poet. Exaggeration or hyperbole is another concept that is used quite a bit within poetry when you describe something as larger or wildly different than it actually is. And so poets use exaggeration to create a mental picture and spark the reader's imagination. Beetles must use polish, they look so new and shiny. The poet stretches the truth about how beetles become shiny to make readers smile and to create greater interest in these insects. It's pretty clear that a beetle is not actually going to use polish to make itself shiny, but this exaggeration creates interest into a rather what normally would be a mundane or pedestrian topic of beetles. Simile, comparison between two things using the words like or as. Poets use comparisons between things to make you think about them in a new way. And it's usually used to surprise the reader and to create some strong images. So the trees are like the hair of the world, the city is like the heart of the world, the wind is a flute player playing in the night, the car's beeping horns are like buttons beeping inside the earth. Each bird is like a single piccolo, singing away in the grass just like me being buried under the snow. So you have comparisons of trees to hair, a city to a heart, car horns beeping to buttons, grass to a person, bird to a piccolo. And so these comparisons using like or as create some surprise and a little bit more emotion and interest on the part of the reader. Whenever we have simile, of course, we have to look at metaphor. This is more of a direct comparison between two things, and it's not using the words like or as. Poets describe a thing or person as if it actually were the other thing or person. So hold fast dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field, frozen with snow. Again, comparison of life to a bird, comparison of life to a field, but it's a much more direct comparison and thus creates a clear, memorable picture and tries to get you to see the original subject in an entirely new way. Onomatopoeia, again, something that we're usually pretty familiar with. Words that sound like the noises they describe. Poets choose words not just for what they mean, but also what they sound like. And again, in the TP cast, this would be the connotation aspect of words. So poets might use onomatopoeia to liven up their writing and add some fun sounds to it. So, oh, crash, my bash, it's bang, the zing, fourth whoosh of boom, July. If the poet had simply just put, oh my, it's the 4th of July, it would not have the same emotion of the crashes, bashes, bangs, zangs, whooshes, barooms, and whoos that a person hears on the 4th of July. So again, it livens up the poem and adds a little bit of intrigue and some fun to it. Personification is a type of metaphor that gives human qualities to animals, objects, or ideas. So, do parks get lonely in winter, perhaps, when benches have only snow on their laps? Parks have feeling and benches have laps. This is not something that we would typically associate with parks or benches, but but it adds life to a poem and helps the reader view a familiar thing again in a new way. So the poet asks whether the parks feel lonely in winter like people sometimes do. An idiom is an everyday saying that doesn't exactly mean what the words truly say or what their denotation would be. So poets use idioms because that's the way people talk to each other. Last night I knew the answers. Last night I had them pat. Last night I could have told you every answer just like that. Last night my brain was cooking. Last night I got them right. Last night I was a genius. So where were you last night? I had them pat, my brain is cooking are phrases that we would know that means knowing something well or it was working fast. But if you did each word individually, their definition, those phrases don't necessarily mean my brain was actually cooking something or your brain was cooking. And having something pat definition wise does not make sense. But idioms add this little bit of colloquialism, a little informality to do something within the poem. So it really is a better explanation or a better representation of how people think and talk within poetry. Symbol is something that stands for something more than just itself, usually suggests some type of larger meaning. An example would be the American flag is a symbol of freedom. It's not just a piece of cloth with the colors red, white, and blue on it. A plot of weeds, an old gray mule, hot sun and sweat on a bright southern day. Strong, stern papa under a straw hat, plowing and planting his whole life away. His backbone is forged of African iron and red Georgia clay. The farmer is a symbol of the proud African culture and the South. African iron and red Georgia clay describe the farmer, but link him to his African ancestors in Africa and his fellow Southerners. Mood of a poem, and again, this would be the attitude within a TP cast, creates a feeling within the reader of the poem, and it can be positive or negative. The poet creates the mood with the length of sentences, the words chosen, punctuation, and the sounds of the words. I heard of poor. It means hungry, no food, no shoes, no place to live, nothing good. It means winter nights and being cold. It is lonely, alone, feeling old. Poor is a tired face, poor is thin, poor is standing outside, looking in. So the short words and lines create a serious mood, and then these words of cold, lonely, alone, old, poor, tired create a feeling of sadness or a rather negative mood within the poem or a negative tone. So specific words or sentences as a whole can create the mood, but make sure to look at the length of sentences as well as the punctuation, not just the individual words within a poem. Tone is the attitude a writer takes toward the subject or audience of a poem. In this poem, The Crocodile, how doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the water of the Nile on every golden scale? How cheerfully he seems to grin, how neatly spreads his claws, and welcomes little fishes in with gently smiling jaws. So the subject of the poem is crocodiles. The author's attitude toward crocodiles is that they are dangerous. So these are all the concepts that we're going to look at within poetry, and there'll be a few others introduced along the way. But again, this presentation was simply meant to give you an overview of the basic elements and the easiest ones to identify within a poem. Good luck with our analysis this unit.